I think the ability to distinguish fact from fiction is an essential prerequisite for a free society. And it's a capacity that's closely linked with the availability of justice in a society. The activities of the courts, and this, by the way, the Engineering Eden is a courtroom drama about nature. It centers on the actual case in the room, in this federal courtroom, when these people bring their disputes together in court. The activities of courts are founded on the idea of there being a truth that we could arrive at by carefully weighing the facts. The custom of swearing in witnesses, the manner in which attorneys test and judges and juries weigh the reliability of witnesses, the penalties for perjury, all of those things point to the way that justice is founded on the notion of truth, of there being some collective truth for us. A free society is based on the idea of justice, and justice is based on the idea that given some diligence, the truth could be arrived at. This is why it's so important to hang on to the idea that it's possible to tell fact from fiction at this particular moment in history. In January, in this now famous interview at NBC's Meet the Press, host Chuck Todd presented presidential advisor Kellyanne Conway with this question about then White House spokesperson Sean Spicer's repetition of President Trump's fanciful claim that he had drawn the largest audience ever to witness a presidential inauguration. Conway famously answered that what Spicer had provided the press with was not lies, but alternative facts. I was interested in this obnoxious appellation, and so I wanted to know, did she just make that up on the spot, or how long has that particular term, alternative facts, been around? So I did some research, and one thing I found out is it doesn't seem like anybody else was doing it, was looking for it. I think many of the people, first of all, the news cycle is accelerating to such an extent that every time we're shocked, we're quickly forgetting how shocked we were for the next shock. So I think that the alternative facts thing fell into a kind of punchline for many of our jokes, and we kind of went on to the next outrage. But I did a little digging, and to find out whether Conway invented it or how far back the term goes. And as far as I can tell, the term alternative facts was coined not by a perpetrator of such corrosion of reality, but by a critic of it, Naomi Oreskes, who many of you in this room have heard of or know about her work. Oreskes was then, at the time that she coined this term, a UCLA and now a Harvard professor of the history of science. And she'd made, as you may know, a brilliant forensic examination of how power, coal, and oil companies, notably ExxonMobil, whose CEO during the period in question that term came out, is now the Trump administration's Secretary of State, managed to sow doubt and confusion about the certainty that climate change was real and catastrophic. In 1991, wrote Oreskes, the Western Fuels Association, a mouthpiece for big coal, oil, and electric power industry, joined with the Western Coal Association and the Edison Electric Institute to create the new Information Council on the Environment, which would, and I quote, reposition global warming as a theory, not fact, and, quote, supply alternative facts to support the suggestion that global warming is good. At this point, of course, to deny that there is a worldwide consensus on the science of climate change is pretty much equivalent to denying gravity. The fact that we now have a White House and cabinet populated with climate deniers is, in fact, the culmination of a century's worth of study of mind control. If you take a look, if you just go on the internet and Google and take a look at old advertisements, pictorial advertisements or written advertisements in newspaper from the mid to late 19th century, or let's say not too late in the 19th, but let's say before the 1890s, what you'll see, let's say in an ad for a wagon or a carriage, you'll see something like, the wagon bed and box are made of the finest knot-free hardwood available. The springs are of the finest steel, and so on. That they're actually talking about the attributes of the product. And then, at the turn of the century, at the same moment that Sigmund Freud is in the process of inventing the human unconscious, purveyors of consumer goods discovered that it's more powerful to appeal to human unconscious than it is to talk about the product itself. It was a great revolution. Freud publishes his theory of the unconscious fully fledged in 1915, just in time for the first real propagandists, 20th century propagandists, to begin deploying real modern war propaganda to stimulate people's fears about the other side and the butchers, the Huns. And this was worked on throughout the First World War. And then after the war, the theory of, that is the First War, the theory of mind control is transferred from war to peacetime uses, and its logic is codified and professionalized by people like Walter Lippmann, the journalist and public relations pioneer, and Freud's nephew on his wife's side, Edward Bernays. The opening words of Bernays' 1928 work, Propaganda, are prophetic. And he says, and I quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." So Bernays goes on to say that when this is properly done, propaganda seems to come from nowhere and everywhere. And the target of that propaganda will think that they are thinking their own thoughts, having their own ideas, when in fact these were ideas propagated by what Bernays calls the invisible government of these propagandists and political ad men and Russian hackers. Bernays refers to this, and multiple times in his 1928 work, as regimenting the thoughts of millions of people, regimenting them. 1928. His ideas have now been fully realized at this point. In 1922, Bernays' colleague, the public relations pioneer Walter Lippmann, writes, and he uses this now famous term, quote, "that the manufacture of consent is capable of great refinements no one, I think, denies. The opportunities for manipulation open to anyone who understands the process. As a result of psychological research, coupled with the modern means of communication, the practice of democracy has turned a corner." Sort of a downward corner, I think, not a sideways corner. So professional advertisers and propagandists continue their work through the Second World War and war propaganda then. And in the 1960s come the deconstructionists like, Jacques Derrida and Paul de Man, who loosed upon the world this tool of critical analysis designed to disable any appeal to a totalizing or collective reality or truth. There's no truth for everyone. We're all stuck within our own cultural assumptions and conditions, and all proposed truths have a potential reach for hegemony on power or something like that. I'm no expert on it. I'm just a park ranger. The final assault on the distinction between fact and fiction has now been carried out by polluting the pool of public opinion with hundreds of thousands of fraudulent news stories and the folksy opinions of fake fellow social media users who are actually digital robots. In a week ago, yesterday, last Tuesday's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on Russian influence in the 2016 presidential election by social media, we learned that Russian disinformation messages, some from hundreds of fake people who weren't people, but Russian hackers, reached 126 million Americans on Facebook alone. On Twitter, 36,000 Russian-linked automated accounts produced 1.4 million tweets between September and the November election. Google admits so far that it's identified 18 YouTube channels tied to Russian fraudulent news that produced more than 1,000 videos, a lot of which were divisive topics like race and religion to get us all mad at each other and to limit our useful work on things that need work. A news analysis by BuzzFeed found that in the final 3 months of the presidential campaign, Facebook's top-performing fraudulent stories got more engagement than the top stories from news outlets like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, NBC News, and so on. The top 20 top performing false stories garnered more than 8.7 million reactions, shares, and comments, while the mainstream news media's top 20 best performing election stories totaled under 7.4 million engagements. So, quote, Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president, picked up 960,000 Facebook engagements, and WikiLeaks confirms Hillary sold weapons to ISIS, generated 789,000. A story that Hillary Clinton and her campaign manager, John Podesta, were operating a child sex ring out of Washington, D.C. in a pizza restaurant was circulated by outlets. It's funny until it isn't, right? Circulated by outlets such as Alex Jones' InfoWars. And that seems so real to some people that a North Carolina man came to D.C. and opened fire on the place with an assault rifle. Alex Jones' InfoWars also ran the story this June that NASA was operating a child slavery ring on Mars. It's funny until it isn't. It is kind of funny. In December of 2015, however, Donald Trump praised Alex Jones' quote, amazing reputation, unquote, and said, I won't let you down if I'm elected, you know. And even after the pizza parlor shooting, an InfoWars reporter was given a White House press pass. There is a connection here with nature. Just stick with me. In February, President Trump tweeted that it was traditional news organizations, ABC, CBS, CNN, the New York Times, and so on, that were fake, not the fakes. His chief strategist, Steve Bannon, came to the White House from a fraudulent news bureau, Breitbart News, and when he left the White House in August to rejoin the site, the president cheered his return to the media, tweeting, fake news needs competition. He was referring to real news as the fake news. In October, after Bannon returned there, Breitbart News fabricated a story that an immigrant, who are our universal whipping people now, had been arrested for starting the deadly Northern California fires that happened in my county. This was immediately refuted by the sheriff in the county where it allegedly occurred. Meanwhile, the administration continued to deny the problem of climate change that actually drives wildfire behavior all over the world. Now, the National Park Service, you knew there was a connection with nature. The National Park Service published its first visitor information brochure on climate change in 2006. A new one citing human beings as the cause of these changes came out, and it must have been rushed out early this year, right after the election. In recent years, in particular, Glacier National Park in Montana has become a place where the public can see for themselves how fast glacial recession and other ecological changes are taking place in response to climate change. The National Park Service, under a superintendent by the name of Jeff Mao, who I've known since we were both in our 20s, interprets for the public what they're seeing on the basis of the best science available. Under an agreement with the Park Service, scientists like Dr. Dan Fagre of the United States Geological Survey are permanently housed in the park to provide intensive research to track what's changing there. The author of something now close to 200 papers, Fagre knows more about what's happening to Glacier in response to climate change than any other human being alive, as far as I can tell. And Superintendent Jeff Mao has become something of a specialist in presiding over parks with melting glaciers and all their problems like meltwater, cutting roads, and all the various things that, that come up with glacial recession. Before Glacier, he worked at Kenai Fjords in Alaska. Early this summer, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg made arrangements to visit Glacier National Park and meet with Superintendent Mao and the ecologist Fagre to learn about and use his notoriety to draw public attention to climate change. In July, about a week before the visit, the Secretary of Interior, Zinke's new public affairs officer, ordered Mao and Fagre not to meet with Zuckerberg. In particular, she used the term stand down. You know, it's a kind of militaristic way of telling somebody, sit down and shut up. She said the USGS will stand down. USGS is U.S. Geological Survey. Those two people were replaced by underlings without any special knowledge of climate change effects on the park. Zuckerberg did come. He had a sanitized tour of the park. He got to meet a ranger dog, and he left. A week and a half ago, I called the National Park Service's chief scientist on climate change to ask him whether his activities had been limited. He called me back the day before yesterday and told me that under a new policy that just came out, he's not allowed to speak to me about science or anything else without permission of his handler. The history of civilization has consisted of this painfully slow climb out of fervent belief in things that aren't true. We do not burn witches anymore, and we don't bleed medical patients. Other than murder and imprisonment, however, there is nothing that renders a people as powerless and vulnerable to exploitation and enslavement than the erosion of the distinction between facts and pernicious falsehoods designed to distract, confuse, and paralyze us with indecision, while the people that have disseminated these obnoxious thought memes plunder the commonwealth, that is, the wealth that belongs to everyone. Clean air and water, the productivity of the soil, robust life systems, a livable future, and a safe, affordable place to go home at night, in order to convert those into private wealth on a scale that few of us can imagine and no human being ever really needs.